A Monroe County man is suing two companies he says are to blame for a devastating well explosion last year that killed two workers and left him with catastrophic burns. Our Chase Campbell reviewed the complaint and spoke with that man's attorney about the case.
20-year-old Chaz Bates was working as a rig hand for Monroe Drilling Operations when the Farnsworth No. 4 Orphan Well blew up last August in Wayne National Forest. Almost exactly 1 year after the explosion, Bates is suing the companies he says are responsible. The lawsuit claims Monroe Drilling and its subcontractor, Formation Cementing, cut corners on safety, including using a wellhead the state had already flagged as leaking weeks before the blast. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources investigated and found Monroe Drilling's, quote, improper implementation of primary and secondary well control barriers, unquote, was the primary cause of the explosion. Bates attorney Spencer Hattemer says the incident never should have happened in the first place.
This didn't have to happen. This is preventable. Ohio Department of Natural Resources, they have safety rules that they put in place for these kinds of projects, and the companies didn't follow them. And, frankly, ODNR knew that those rules weren't being followed, and they didn't stop the job.
As a result of that failure to follow the rules, what the lawsuit characterizes as gross negligence and recklessness, Hattemer says Bates is left with injuries he'll carry for the rest of his life.
There's nothing that's going to bring him back to where he was before. He went through this horrific incident. He lost coworkers that he worked with. He suffered burns across his entire body. I know his other friends who were working there that day were hurt too. He's in the hospital for months. He had to relearn how to walk.
Hattemer says he hopes the lawsuit will prevent tragedies like this from being repeated.
What this lawsuit's really about is about making sure this doesn't happen again, and making sure that companies and the state that contracts them in this case are going to abide by safety regulations, enforce those regulations, and make sure that this kind of explosion doesn't happen again.
Bates is asking for compensatory and punitive damages and a jury trial. An attorney representing Monroe Drilling said the company wouldn't comment on pending litigation. Formation Cementing has not responded to a request for comment. Chase Campbell, WTAP News.